We're in. So, good morning to viewers in Europe, and a very early good morning to anybody watching in the US. I'm Luke Johnson. I'm the author of The Public Sphere Substack. So, last night, EU leaders held an emergency summit in Brussels, which was scheduled earlier in the week after US President Donald Trump threatened tariffs over Greenland. Trump withdrew that threat on Wednesday night very abruptly, but EU leaders still met anyway, and discussed, maybe a path forward to dealing with a very mercurial leader in the White House who seems to fundamentally distrust Europe and disregard the transatlantic alliance, which has existed for some 80 years. So I'll be discussing this summit with Dave Keating, who is the author of the Gulf Stream Blues Substack. And he writes about European politics, and he was at the summit last night, and he's the author of a new book called The Own Continent. So, Dave, what was the mood there like yesterday?
Yeah, it was a late night. I was there till 2:30 in the morning, so I'm a little rough this morning, but it was, as one journalist said to me as he was leaving last night at 2:30, this was a summit that could have been an email. This was an embarrassment for the EU, what happened last night. And look, there weren't any easy answers here. This was a weird one because, as you mentioned, this summit was an emergency summit called by the council chair, Antonio Costa, on Saturday after Trump's threats to tariff the countries that had sent troops to Greenland. That threat, as we can talk about maybe later, crossed four major red lines for Europe, and they had to respond. So Costa calls this emergency summit, schedules it for Thursday night, but then late Wednesday night, Trump pulls an about face and says, nope, the tariffs are off, and I'm rescinding my threat of invading Greenland militarily because he has this supposed deal with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the contents of which we still do not know, which I think means there effectively is no deal, and not even really the framework of a deal, as he said. There's nothing new here. He was just looking for an off-ramp, a face-saving off-ramp. But obviously that announcement last night begged the question, will this summit be canceled? Because the thing that it was called for is now off. President Costa decided not to cancel the summit. And that was for two reasons. One is these summits are really expensive. You have to rekit the whole Justus Lipsius building for the press and for the arrivals. And you also have to pay the Belgian state a huge amount of money to organize the security. Huge amount. So if they had canceled this summit, Belgium ain't given them a refund. So this would have been a big waste of taxpayer money. The other problem would have been the optics. If you cancel the summit, then it looks like you're saying, relax, everybody, everything's back to normal, things are fine. So they had the summit, but I think in the end, it did more harm than good because they were too nervous to really say or do anything that might offend Donald Trump and make him rescind the rescinding of the tariffs. So they kind of forced, basically all this did was make all of the EU national leaders converge in Brussels at great expense and great inconvenience, and kind of forced them to praise the transatlantic relationship because they were afraid to do anything else. Just a couple examples. Romania's president, when he was coming in, was asked, is the EU-US relationship broken? He said, no, absolutely not. It's great. The Lithuanian president, Nausėda, came in saying it was outrageous that the EU was even considering activating retaliatory measures against the US because of these threats. The US is a partner and a friend. We should never do anything against them. And even the more hawkish leaders in Europe, Macron, Sanchez, were fairly guarded last night. So you ended up with a summit that just looked like they were legitimizing Donald Trump because they felt they had no choice. And the two actions they could have taken, asking the Commission to prepare the anti-coercion instrument for possible use against the US if Trump changed his mind in the future, and a common EU position on whether or not to join Trump's Board of Peace, they failed on both of those. They didn't do those. The only material outcome of this summit was pro-Trump. It was commanding the European Parliament to unfreeze its ratification of the EU-US so-called surrender deal that President von der Leyen reached with Donald
Right.
Trump back in July. The parliament was actually supposed to ratify that this week. They suspended that, and the leaders last night said, knock it off. On Monday, when you have a meeting, we want that back on the schedule, which pissed off a lot of MEPs. This was a mess last night.
Right. So, was there any sort of silver lining to this? I mean, you had 27 leaders in one place after a fairly remarkable week. Just with these threats, which crossed a number of red lines, and was there any, I don't know, silver lining to everybody being in the same room and being able to hash things out? You know,
I mean, one official that I was talking to described this as group therapy. It
right,
was just kind of, they went around the table and everyone talked about how sad they were. They're so sad about the end of the transatlantic alliance, but they're not sad enough to do anything about it. This was, I can't really think of anything good. I mean, I want to say here, I don't envy the choice that Antonio Costa had to make
right.
yesterday morning, because there were no good options here. If you cancel the
Right.
summit, it would look really bad. If you
Well, if
have
you
the summit,
cancel
it
the
looks
summit, it
bad.
looks like problem solved,
Exactly. Yeah.
Trump, but he could tomorrow he could post on social media. The problem is that there's no stability. Like, how do you even govern when I mean, I looked at my phone. I was exhausted from Wednesday after, watching the Trump speech, which I didn't even watch all of. I watched like three-quarters of it. And then a friend texted me. He said, "Oh, the Trump tariffs are off." And my first reaction was like, "What?"
What?
Like
Yeah.
like like
Yeah.
I just
Same. I
I got
Press 24 called me for a live, and I'm like, on the what? I said, because I haven't
yeah,
seen
I
it.
mean, I don't know. I don't think the crisis has passed in any meaningful way because, he could just issue a Truth Social post tomorrow saying, I mean, the Supreme Court could do something about this, but we don't know when they'll say something. And that's a whole nother thing. But it doesn't seem at all like the crisis is past.
I think really the problem too is last night in Antonio Costa's press conference at the end of the summit, he says, well, we can't call summits every time Donald Trump does something. It begs the question, then why did you call this one? I think this,
Right.
I would say that Costa had no good options after Trump's about face, but I don't think that calling the summit in the first place worked out very well. This was an attempt to insert the EU into this issue to kind of show EU unity or to show the EU strength, and it achieved exactly the opposite. And normally I would be all for the EU getting involved in something like this. Indeed, when Donald Trump threatens individual EU countries with tariffs, it means he is refusing to recognize the existence of the EU, because under EU law, you can't have separate tariffs on individual EU countries. So the EU had to
Right.
respond. But did it have to respond with a summit? I'm not sure. I mean, most of the leaders, or at least the ones that matter, were all in Davos, and Davos is where this got settled.
Yeah.
So I think this was probably an outcome that Costa should have anticipated, that there could be a resolution in Davos, and then they would be left looking really foolish on Thursday. I think the only way this would have worked is if he had scheduled it for Monday or maybe Tuesday before Trump was in Davos, so that the EU would get its ducks in order. You would
Mhm.
still have the urgency of the threat that might have motivated them to task the commission with preparing the anti-coercion instrument. But I don't think logistically they could have.
Right, because that would have been on like 2 days' notice. And as you said, there's a bunch of security issues, and not to mention logistical issues involved in getting people around the same table. Was there any way that, they were ready, according to the FT, they were readying 93 billion in retaliatory tariffs? Obviously, to like a large extent, that seems, not like something they would do now after the tariffs threats off. Is there any way they can say, like, hey, we have this baseball bat in the corner, like the next time you do it, like it might actually happen? Or is it something that they'd have to respond to once the tariff threat actually happens?
Yeah, so that's the thing. That's the thing they could have done last night, but they chose
Hmm.
not to. And the White House will have seen that they chose not to. And that's why I think the summit was so damaging. There's two tariff retaliation things they can do. So one is that 93 billion package of retaliatory tariffs that was drawn up last year after the Liberation Day announcement, but they basically drew it up and then put it on ice once they reached that quote unquote surrender deal with Donald Trump in July. But it's still there. And actually, it's ready to take effect at any moment. They have to keep extending its suspension, which they did last night. I didn't mention that. That's the other Trump thing they did last night. I mean, pro-Trump is maybe exaggerating it.
Well, how is it pro-Trump if they extended the threat? I mean, it's still on the table.
No. It would have taken effect on February 6th. And they
then they delayed it another.
They delayed it, yeah.
Okay,
which is the thing they keep doing. So the way they've structured this is that that 93 billion retaliatory package is always there, and they just keep voting to extend or delay it. And that's meant to put the pressure on the U.S. So yeah, that's the other thing they did last night. Then separate from that, there's the anti-coercion instrument, what some people call the nuclear option. I think that's exaggerating its effect.
Which they've never used before.
And it was only created a couple of years ago.
With China. In 2023. Yeah,
in 2023, they created this thinking that China would use its trade leverage over the EU in order to menace it in some way. So now, I mean, what Trump is doing is the very definition of coercion. It's crazy that they're not activating this. I mean, that they're not preparing it. So this is the deal. What they can do right now, obviously they wouldn't activate the instrument because Trump hasn't gone ahead with these tariffs, but Ursula von der Leyen, the ever an Atlanticist at heart, always tiptoeing around Donald Trump, does not want to start work on preparing this instrument, at least not that we know of. So the feeling is that the council needs to tell her. I mean, she does whatever the member states tell her to do.
Right.
So they need to tell her, you need to start preparing this instrument because it will take 3 months, where we hear from experts, to prepare this so-called trade bazooka. And so if they don't start preparing it now, and let's say in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, Donald Trump says, I'm angry again. Now there's 50% tariffs on the EU starting tomorrow. They can put in that 93 billion retaliatory tariffs. That's actually not very much, but the big bazooka, they have ready to go. And they could have had it ready if they started preparing it last night. But the thing is, technically, the commission does not need a member state request to start doing this. So I think the question now is, does the commission start preparing this quietly anyway? But I think you really have to say you're doing it publicly. I mean, the whole point of it is deterrence. If we're in a situation where the EU has to activate this, that's economic mutually assured destruction. We do not want to get to that point. And if the White House thinks that the EU is unprepared here and it slaps on these tariffs, and then surprise, surprise, actually the commission was preparing the ACI in secret, they're in a bad position there. So I don't think it makes sense to be preparing this quietly. The whole point is that it should be a deterrent.
The whole point that it's a signal that, hey, we're ready to do this tomorrow. If it's, Saturday morning and you decide to, slap tariffs on EU countries because of, it's so mercurial. You look at
200% tariffs on wines because France won't join the Board of Peace.
Actually, that's a good example, but I was going to mention another thing is that, Trump disinvited Mark Carney from the Board of Peace last night or this morning or whenever I woke up because, of his speech, which got so much attention, and he was furious about it. He called him by his first name, Mark. You should watch your statements. And then he sent a very childish reversal. And so it is just so mercurial, and you just do not know, you see in these sort of leaked text messages that were sent by Emmanuel Macron and others that they are so tiptoeing around, hey, Donald Trump, hey, buddy, hey, Donald, we want to, let's meet, let's do a summit. But, this only works so much because the moment somebody says the wrong thing, he might say, I'm launching 20% tariffs. I want to talk about deterrence.
Just real quickly on that. Yeah. That's why if, as I'm sure they will, this week, the European Parliament unfreezes the ratification of the surrender deal from last year, that would go to a vote, I think, the first week of February. the United States has already violated the terms of that agreement. That agreement said that the US would accept a baseline of 15% tariffs and accept this tributary payment of $1.35 trillion from Europe to the US in exchange for, quote, stability and predictability, as President von der Leyen put it. That's clearly not happening. The US keeps threatening tariffs. It
Right.
keeps tariffs if the EU doesn't change its legislation, if individual countries
Over X and
over
things like
digital
that.
laws
Yeah,
mainly,
Elon
but
Musk's
also climate laws. So
company.
the U.S. is clearly not living up to its end of the bargain. And last night in the press conference, when Ursula von der Leyen said, "Okay, now we're going to ratify that. We must ratify that deal immediately because the EU holds to its bargains. The EU keeps its word."
Right.
Okay, why should the EU keep its word when the United States, the other partner in this treaty, is clearly not keeping its word? I mean, this is
But does the
classic.
EU keep it? But does the EU keep its word? I mean, on Wednesday, the Mercosur deal, the European Parliament, in a surprise vote, actually voted to send it to the Europe's top court, which will take,
2 years.
six,
Yeah.
12, 24 months. And this was really a shock vote because people thought it was in the bag, that this trade deal with South America, which is exactly what European countries should be doing, diversifying away from the US, de-risking. And then European Parliament lawmakers said, let's kind of send it back because we really don't, in our heart of hearts, we really don't want this deal. For really provincial reasons about farmers in France and things like that. I mean, I can see it doesn't seem like that, they're talking about independence and things like that, but it seems like that they lost this kind of big vote narrowly by like 10 votes.
10 votes. Yeah.
10 votes. And the rule number one of legislators is never call a vote that you're going to lose.
Yeah.
So where's their word?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons why this happened. So there's two houses of the EU's legislature. The upper house, the council, passed Mercosur in this very contentious vote because of Italy. Italy changed sides. And so then it passed. And usually the way that it's worked in the past is once the council approves it, the commission kind of figures it's done. So Ursula von der Leyen went to Paraguay and signed the deal. But the European Parliament, the lower house of the legislature, had not voted on the FTA yet. So MEPs were kind of pissed off that she went ahead and signed the treaty. They were pissed off that the commission was already talking about provisional application before the parliament had had its say so. Look, it would have passed the parliament if it was a vote on the actual treaty. But what happened is they let this anger fester within the parliament. And then they had this separate vote on the idea of sending it to the European Court of Justice for review. Now, the fingerprints of this are in Paris. The French. I mean, here's what's kind of outrageous about this. France lost a democratic vote in the European Council. And the way they're responding is these kind of nefarious ways of killing the treaty in other ways. So you had as far as I can tell, kind of the entirety of the French MEPs in the parliament voting for sending this to the European Court of Justice, all the Polish MEPs, basically the countries that had voted against this but were outvoted. And you know what?
That have agricultural interests. Yeah.
But that wasn't the reason this motion was tabled. It was actually tabled for the reasons that the farmers hate. This was a far left resolution about climate issues.
Yeah.
They're concerned that under the terms of the deal, the South American countries can object to EU climate laws. So the farmers and the far right who joined in on this resolution did so very cynically because it actually the specific issue that they're asking the court to review is something they hate: climate laws. It's about protecting climate laws. So there's a lot of nonsense going on.
Right.
But the point is, this was kind of an accident that this passed. There were also 8 Spanish MEPs who were missing. I don't know where they were. They just didn't bother to show up. If they had showed up, they would have voted against this and it wouldn't have passed. So this was kind of a disaster of vote counting. The huge embarrassment for President von
Just
der Leyen.
incompetence,
Yeah,
really.
for the
Just
speaker, Roberta Metsola. I mean, this was
yeah. You should
really,
never
really
call a
dumb.
vote that you think you're going to lose.
But I think on
And
your point too, to hear all of these leftist French MEPs, let's say all French MEPs, actually, to be fair, not just left, also far
right,
right
right, right, right,
center,
right,
saying that the EU needs to be strong and the EU needs to be stand up in the world on one
right.
hand, and then turn around and reject this thing, which I have my opinions about whether or not Mercosur or trade deals in general can save the European Union. I think they can't. But Mercosur is good for the EU, and it's desperately needed at this moment to send a signal that the EU is still relevant. So what they've
Right.
done here is majorly handicap the EU. Now, I
Do you
think
think they're going
von der Leyen
to
is overplaying her hands here by thinking
Do you
now
think
with
they're
this
going to do
stability
something
summit.
like that with the EU-US deal, like that it's not going to pass, or do you think that'll?
I hope so. I mean, they
You hope
should.
so.
If they have
Yeah,
any
you hope
dignity, they
so.
should
Right.
reject that. I mean, but that won't happen because the fear is, of course, if they reject that trade deal, it's like the in their minds, it's the thing that's keeping the White House calm, and so they think like they're out of the storm. So if they then vote again to reject this ratification, then the EU is going to respond. But they should just wait. Why do this on
Right.
Monday? I mean, this is
Right.
ridiculous. We don't even know what the terms of this Greenland deal are.
It's far from
They shouldn't hold this vote
let's
because
talk about
actually, I was just going to say, if
the
they do
Greenland deal.
reject
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
if they reject the ratification, that could very well trigger Trump and the White House. They should not hold this vote. It's too risky. Just wait a couple months.
Right. See what's going to happen. I mean, on the other hand, we've been talking about EU dysfunction. There have been like a lot of, I think Ursula von der Leyen was praising like European solidarity and unity and the threat of a threat, I guess, is what you would call it,
Mm.
in getting Trump to back down over Greenland. Was this a win in some way? Did Europe stand up to the bully?
Von der Leyen used some real weasel words last night in her press conference. She was trying to have it both ways. She kept saying the quote over and over that the EU's response had been firm, quote, firm and non-escalatory, unquote.
Yes,
And
that's the
that
word I was
is
looking
what,
for.
and she's
Yeah.
saying that is what got Donald Trump to back down. But which is it? Was it the firmness or the non-escalatoriness? Because as the EU leaders were coming into the summit last night, it was clear that they have two totally different narratives about what happened over the previous 24 hours. In one camp, you have Giorgia Meloni and I think Friedrich Merz
Yeah.
and many of the Eastern EU countries saying, no, what won the day here was calmness and negotiation and flattering Trump, the continuation of the daddy diplomacy. That's what got him to back down. It was Mark Rutte's line of thinking. But then you had people like Emmanuel Macron and Pedro Sanchez who say, no, it was the firmness that did it. It was the EU sending the troops to Greenland in the first place that made the White House freak out because they weren't used to Europeans pushing back. And that's
Right.
why they backed down in this instance, because the White House was so caught off guard by Europeans standing up for themselves. So which is it, Ursula? Was it the
Well,
firmness?
well,
Or
it's really
was
hard
it the
to say
non-escalatory?
because both of those narratives fit into their pre-existing beliefs about how to deal with Trump. And, I know there have been leaks in New York Times and other publications saying that, they've that Mark Rutte has been willing to look at like the sovereignty over bases, which is something that Denmark has not agreed to at all. I mean, the reality is we really don't know why Trump backed down, and he could reinstate the pressure like tomorrow, basically, over this.
Yes and no. I just find it completely implausible that Trump came to Davos still on the rampage, intending to continue this, intending to, if necessary, invade Greenland by force, and then a conversation with Mark Rutte talked him out of it. It was the markets, it was the pushback he was getting from Republican senators. But the reason that the markets and the Republican senators were reacting this way is because Europe was making it clear they were not just going to hand over Greenland
Right.
peacefully. And so in my vantage point, I wrote about this on Substack yesterday,
Right.
it was the firmness. It was Europe standing up and being strong. Macron is right about this. Meloni is wrong. And Ursula von der Leyen is wrong if she's saying that it was both things. Because in my mind, it really was the show of strength. And not, I mean, if Giorgia Meloni had her way, there would have been no troops going to Greenland. You have the Italian defense minister mocking the European troop deployment to Greenland and saying it was a bad thing because it was provoking the United States. So if
Well, that is how
Meloni
they
was
took
running
it.
Europe,
That
we
is
would
how
have
they took
surrendered
it.
immediately.
That is
It
how
was
they
how they
took
took
it.
it, and then they
Yeah.
backed down. So
Right.
yeah, they
And some of
their
them
comments
left
showed
after
that.
like Sunday in Germany and other countries.
Yeah.
Denmark still has troops there, but many of the other European countries left because they were scared.
What's clear is that the White House wasn't laughing like the Italian defense minister at the troop deployment. They took it very seriously. They said outright that it was, I think Lutnick used the word a provocation or something like that. So clearly they didn't think it was a joke. They reacted first like with incredulousness, then launching the tariffs, and then they backed down. And that should be the lesson here. The Americans clearly saw this as a credible threat, not militarily. Europe can't win a war against the US.
No, and there's like 12 troops from Germany there.
Troops.
They could fit in my apartment.
But they took it as a serious threat because they could see that Europe was never going to allow Trump to take Greenland without completely blowing up the world order, the transatlantic relationship.
And the economy, I might add.
And the economy.
And the economy, I might add.
Yeah. So it was the threat that worked. Von der Leyen is just wrong by saying it was the non-escalatory nature of the EU's response that did it. No, that's the old way. Last year was non-escalatory. Last year was appeasement. This time, it actually showed some backbone. And look at the results. But now we've these EU politicians, particularly from Europe's east and Italy, that are taking the exact wrong lesson here, that are saying, no, it was our appeasement and our daddy diplomacy that got us this great result. Let's keep it going. Well, and even Chancellor Merz said that in his speech, that he has no intention of changing his U.S. strategy.
Well, in Eastern Europe, they at least have the excuse. I mean, it's a really real threat that they have to deal with Russia and,
But we all have to deal with Russia, not just...
Right. But they all have to deal with Russia, and they're actually doing things to deal with Russia, like spending on defense, whereas France is more part of this, confront Trump camp, but, Italy and, and Spain, these countries, do not have to deal with Russia in any significant way and, would rather, on some level rely on the United States and its cheap sort of security umbrella. Whereas Eastern Europe faces like really hard choices in, about nuclear weapons and
yes and no, but I would point out, yes, the Eastern EU countries feel more threatened by Russia and that drives their behavior. That is true. But if Putin invades the Baltics, we are all at war with Russia, including Spain. So it's not that we are all at risk of a Russian invasion. It's just that the end of that war means a greater risk for those countries in the East to be occupied and annexed, where Spain doesn't face that threat. Russia isn't going to annex Spain, but Spain will be at war with Russia.
Right.
Treaty bound. So, both through NATO and through the European Union, which has its own mutual defense clause. So, Eastern Europeans like to say this all the time. Well, we're the ones really at risk, and you Western Europeans don't care. We're all going to war with Russia if you in the Baltics get invaded. That's number one. Number two is that at the same time they say this, they are blocking European defense. Poland, the Baltics, the usual suspects, Hungary, Czechia, all of them have been blocking EU defense for years because they say it would be damaging duplication with NATO. They want the US to be the only defense game in town. And that's why we are where we are. Europe is weak right now because of those Eastern Europeans, because they've blocked sovereign, independent European defense for so long, and they're still blocking it today.
Well, do they trust sovereign, independent European defense?
Yeah, that's the issue. They don't.
Yeah, that's the issue. Is they don't trust
the Americans more than their fellow Europeans, but that's stupid. I mean, look at America.
I mean, is it? I mean, the U.S. has so many more nuclear weapons than.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons the U.S. has if the U.S. isn't coming to your defense. I mean, when you had President Nasser going into that summit last night saying the U.S. is a great partner and a friend, and why are we talking about any retaliation against them? What world is he living in? It doesn't matter how strong the U.S. is. If the umbrella isn't actually there, if the U.S.
Right.
isn't going to defend NATO, then all of that is meaningless. Whereas I think it's self-evident that the Eastern Europeans can trust their fellow Europeans at least to go to war with Russia if they are attacked. I do not think. I'm sure a lot of them
I mean,
think
do you
that
think so?
Spain, Italy,
Because,
France will find
look
that
at
war
World
better.
War II. Look at World War II. The Europeans did go to war. I mean, France and Britain did go to war again, like with Poland, but it was on paper, until France was actually invaded, and look how that turned out. I mean, there is like this really deep distrust in a place like Poland about whether European countries would actually do something, if they were invaded.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is justified, and there is a real risk that you would just have a war on paper,
Right.
particularly when it comes to like Italy and Spain. I mean, what are they going to do? Probably France and the UK would say, "Please just stay home," because they don't have a great record when it comes to warfare, particularly Italy. But I do personally strongly believe that at least the UK and France would actually go to war to defend these the eastern border of the European Union. Uh, some other countries I'm not so sure. Italy in particular, I'm not so sure, but they would at least participate on paper. I don't. Maybe Hungary, but Hungary would be in a very weird position there because if Hungary said, "Nope, we're staying out of this war. We're going to be neutral," they
Well,
really,
Hungary's army is like not that consequential, whereas Britain and France have nuclear weapons. So I
yeah.
think
But
that
if
is,
So what would happen then, I'm pretty sure, is that it would actually turn into a staging alliance with Russia. That it would be
yeah.
kind of a fake neutrality because Russia would actually be staging troops there. And that might make the Western allies think that they need to occupy Hungary to counter that as a pre-step, especially since it's bordering Ukraine. I don't know. We're into the realm of
Yeah, we're into
great
the weeds a bit,
hypothesis
and I
here.
and I kind of want to wind this down
Yeah.
with just like what should we be watching next in the EU? Like, this is so unpredictable. But is there anything you know we should be watching the future about this sort of fragmented relationship?
Well, we have this next European Council summit on February 12th. So this is an informal council. This is another reason why it was so dumb to call this, because there's one coming up on the February 12th anyway, which is already an informal summit. It's going to be out at a castle here in Belgium, and it is meant as another one of these discussions. Perhaps it may be that last night the European leaders were too shell shocked and confused by what had happened over the previous couple of days to actually have a real substantive
You mean that they
discussion.
actually pushed back, or what?
Yeah, it may be that
Yeah,
at that summit on February 12th, they actually can have a real discussion and come out with some real threats. It just kind of depends what happens over the next
yeah.
2 weeks. So that's one thing to watch. I think that it's going to be a question of whether Trump reignites these threats at any moment. I think the real key thing here is that the lesson that's been learned over the past year, and a lot of people have written about that, is the countries that pushed back against Trump's tariff threats last year, China, India,
Brazil.
Brazil, they got
Yeah,
off. Trump kind
yeah,
of forgot about them. Trump drops the
yeah.
tariffs, stops talking about them. But the countries that were weak, the countries that
Right.
immediately surrendered, Trump smells blood and he keeps going.
It keeps
The,
pushing.
yeah,
Yeah.
the Europeans kind of displayed their hindquarters to Trump and to signaling that they're an easy victim, and Trump keeps going. So,
Right.
does this show of strength, if we do believe, as I believe, that it was a show of strength here that made Trump back off, is he now going to back off of Europe like he backed off of Brazil, of India, and China? But then I wonder, but who's left? Who's left that he can go after on the international stage? Maybe Venezuela, Cuba. Maybe he now turns his attention to invading Cuba, invading Colombia, Panama,
Right.
Venezuela, and forgets about Europe. There is no way of knowing, and that's the scary thing for Europeans is they have no control here. They are completely subject to Trump's
Right.
whims and whether he's paying attention to them or not. But I would say that the lesson of the last year is that if you push back, Trump tends to then forget about you.
I'm reminded of the saying, the German saying, if you don't fight, you will lose. If you fight, you may lose. I'm paraphrasing. So, we'll see what happens, unintentionally quoting Trump's favorite saying, but always good to talk to you. And
That's great to
yeah,
talk to you too.
yeah. All right. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.